Agriculture, a fundamental component for the evolution of human civilizations. It employs one-third of the world's labor force and feeds more than 6 billion people. Farmland has increased its size by fivefold in the last 200 years, and modern agricultural practices combine protectionist policies such as crop subsidization with the benefits of key productivity maximization technologies: irrigation, mechanization, fertilization, pest control, and genetic enhancement. And while modern society has been relatively successful to secure food supply in the richer areas, many issues revolve around the sustainability of the status quo. One-third of the world's labor force is employed in the agriculture industry, which translates to 1.3 billion people worldwide. This figure dramatically increases in developing countries where more than half of the labor force works on the land. What is then the impact of modern agriculture practices on employment when technology replaces human labor? Some examples of ecological negative externalities include soil erosion, mineral depletion, eutrophication, and deforestation, which leads to land degradation, desertification, water degradation, and flora and fauna extinction. How environmentally sustainable are our current agriculture practices, and what is the impact of climate change? The OECD countries' total population growth is estimated to be 16% from today through 2050. However, agriculture shows the smallest production growth, an indicator of the heavy import requirements in the future. The Food and Agriculture Organizations of the United Nations and OECD predict that the largest growth in the next 10 years are expected in the BRIC countries and the lowest developed countries. BRIC countries make up 40% of global population and 25% of world land coverage. How can we ensure food availability with an ever-growing demand while simultaneously making food affordable for all socioeconomic strata? The growing urbanization trend has insulated us from both these issues and food shortage issues, at least outside of the bottom of the pyramid. And the fact is that modern agronomy, plant breeding, pesticides, fertilizers, and technological improvements have sharply increased yields from cultivation, but at the same time have caused widespread ecological damage and negative human health effects. This leads us to our central question: how can game-changing technologies change the livelihood of agriculture in a global context? We will analyze the impact and future of game-changing technologies under two different scenarios: Napoleon, which relates to a protectionist scenario, and Wilbur, relating to the transformative
Napoleon scenario, 2020. Widespread genetic engineering of seeds has homogenized the genetic profile of the staple food crops of the protectionist countries. A new disease strain that targeted that particular genetic profile wiped out an entire year's harvest, causing a massive famine. Genetic drift has had serious implications for the local ecosystems. The generic pesticides used to combat the disease has massively damaged the soil, and further the growth of crops is highly questionable. In the initial years of genetically modified crop seeds, the countries under the Napoleon scenario built up a surplus of staple foods. The surplus was often used for the production of biofuels, and those countries without access to oil were virtually self-sufficient in regards to energy supply. However, as the food supplies dwindled, biofuels became less of a priority, and these countries once again looked towards fossil fuels to meet their energy demands. The sheer scale of the problems meant that governments were unable to provide for or absorb the millions of unemployed agricultural workers back into the economy. Many farmers left the industry permanently, seeing no future for them or future.
Wilbur scenario, 2020. A trade war is underway between the US and EU over GMO issues. Consumers remain on the fence with consuming food that has been genetically modified. The uncertainty of GMO impacts have left countries like the EU undecided and divided on the regulations and distribution of GM foods on the market. For countries like the US that have more openly embraced GMOs, it has left them with a surplus of GM crops and GM meat on the market, but with no buyers. This excess food supply leaves the agriculture sector with massive unemployment. Generations of farmers are left with little choices as they look towards the future. Will things change for the better? How will they feed their families? Children who once had to stay behind to help on the farm can now go to school, but at what cost? Since GMOs remain controversial, the push for in vitro meat in turn has been halted. As the world population grows, so does our consumption of livestock. Livestock levels are diminishing at an alarming rate, and there are concerns that in vitro meat may be the only meat available for consumption in the near future. To counter this, governments have united to utilize biopharmaceuticals on cows, allowing them to live longer and healthier. However, this only deepens the problem as a result of cow overpopulation, excess methane levels, and land grazing shortages.
Napoleon scenario, 2030. After the disastrous famine in 2020, Napoleon countries have learned from past mistakes. Due to the experiences made with genetically modified crops, the Napoleon countries have become very cautious in this regard, despite the considerable developments that have been made in this sector. The soils have recovered somewhat and are ready to be cultivated again. However, instead of growing foodstuff for the populace, the land is being used to raise livestock. With machines taking over most of the tasks held by animals in the past, the livestock is destined for the dinner table. With consumers in the Wilbur countries preferring choice over whether to have free-range or laboratory-grown meat, farmers are supplying a niche group of customers that are still willing to pay a premium for this kind of free-range meat. Raising livestock for food outside of a laboratory in the Wilbur countries has become extremely expensive, with governments heavily taxing the producers of such meat due to the considerable environmental issues such as overgrazing and methane. This niche has provided a source of revenue for some of the farmers that were affected by the crisis in 2020. However, the revenues are not sufficient to support the same amount of workers as found prior to the crisis. Thankfully, many of the next generation of potential farmers who had been teenagers at the time when the crisis hit adapted their skill sets to the changing market by going to leading universities and taking courses more geared towards the current economy. With the newest generation of biofuels having been introduced to Napoleon countries by concerned Wilbur countries looking to cut back on all carbon emissions, Napoleon countries are once again energy self-sufficient and their carbon footprint is next to nothing.
Wilbur scenario, 2030. All the game-changing technologies have come together. Looking back just 20 years ago, we were faced with rising oil prices, fears of global warming, and rapidly diminishing natural resources. The future was uncertain, but fast forward 2 decades and now biofuels are in its 10th generation. We no longer rely on corn for ethanol production. Instead, we now use a variety of plant-based materials, in turn keeping more corn for actual consumption. Biofuels are now super efficient to produce and is no longer a costly process to society or the environment. The biopharmaceuticals we used just 10 years ago are no longer in production. Instead, it's been replaced by biological machines, paving the way for the future of agriculture, precision farming. Imagine this. It's 5 a.m., a farmer in Idaho sips coffee in front of his computer. He sees up-to-the-minute satellite images scrolling across. A red alert message pops up indicating a weed problem in field 86, on the southwest corner of the farm, where potatoes are growing. He gets up, walks to the computer, and with the click of a button, by 5:30, the biological machines located in field 86 have received the precise amount of herbicide needed. Programmable, cell-based materials. This is the fate of farming, known as precision farming. Valuable data is tracked and stored on a massive cloud network of farmers around the world. Its purpose? Think of it as a disease control center, a production schedule hub. Forecasting is no longer a blind activity. Surpluses of crops and milk are gone. A steady, unlimited data stream available 24/7 enables farmers to work closely together to produce only what's needed and in the proper conditions. Countries are cooperating and sharing information. Grandpa Jack, who has slaved away laboriously for the last 50 years, no longer needs to break his back worrying about pest control or even harvesting. Game-changing technologies that we thought inferior in 2010 is now a reality. The once-upon-a-time generations of farmers is slowly winding down. Increasingly less labor force is needed. With technologies ready to help at the click of a button, new generations can afford an education and pursue a career outside of agriculture, outside of the family business. There's hope for the future.
Both scenarios prove that game-changing technology can be a mixed blessing. The initial years were marked by a series of knee-jerk reactions that led to technologies being introduced before the real implications were known. The development of the agricultural industry can be compared to a set of Newton balls that started moving in 2010. With big movements in the early years, over time the forces got smaller and agriculture, the economy and civilization as a whole achieved some kind of balance in 2013. The effects of game-changing technologies are not limited by national boundaries, and for this reason eventually the Wilbur countries will prevail, especially when considering the environmental costs of maintaining a Napoleon scenario that has short-term benefits but can be very damaging in the long term. A further point to note that some issues cannot be resolved with game-changing technologies, an example being the lack of perspective for the upcoming generations in agriculture. This change will be, in keeping with the general film of this film, an organic one, resistant to developments in technology, but instead dependent only on the passage of time.